Good evening, everyone. And I begin by thanking Overman Foundation for giving me the opportunity of delivering these talks. So, we were discussing the course of English poetry last time, and discussing the course of English poetry further. Sri Aurobindo takes us along the next 100 years journey, which is the beginning of the age of intellect in the literary scene of England. Now, here too, as is usual with Sri Aurobindo, as we have seen, here too he acquaints us with the nature of this poetry, its creators, and also its successes and failures. The intellectual and classical age of English poetry began certainly with the promise of good things and has left us fruits of extraordinary power of achievements here and there. Yet, we'll say it's a curious fact about this age, and it's that it displays all through an imperfect balance of faculties, and its success and energy is ever matched by its characteristic defects, leading to what Sri Aurobindo himself terms splendid failure at times. So that's very interesting. Now, it is the streak of rawness, he says, which has marred and dampened the genius of the poet many a time. Now, we may talk about another very interesting fact about this age, and that is the poets of the age were influenced by and chose as the models of imitation the literature and writers of Greece, Rome, and France. Okay, so the three typically intellectual nations of Europe. But what happens when we just imitate? That it's not enough to imitate without having the same equal capacities of creative production. For the result of such blank imitations anywhere, anytime, can be nothing but something inferior. And this is where the English poets met with failure. They chose classical models and intellectual stuff to deal with, but as Sri Aurobindo has observed, the English mind does not inherently possess intellectual depth and subtlety, nor is it successfully capable of classical lucidity or aesthetic taste as we find in their chosen models, which were the sources of their poetic creations. So, what the English mind actually was capable of, and what it had in their power was a masculine force, a strong imagination, and intuitive suggestiveness. And this they tried to blend and wield with the borrowed classical form. So, evidently, uh, the wielding wasn't done properly, and so much less was achieved than was desired and expected. And this was because there was a violent breaking away, a departure, a rejection of the past, and a venture into new avenues with no roots in the past. That is, this kind of tradition in England, they had no such tradition to fall back upon, that is, in their own country. So even then, it would have met with some success if the new mode had retained the best of the past and with that enriched the classical form, incorporating into it the intellectual motive. But this kind of revolutionary departure, all with this departure, all earlier structures were lost and given up. The new turn of poetry was, according to Sri Aurobindo, very elegant, very cold, and very empty. The satire and the didactic verse replaced the preceding forms and motives, and in Sri Aurobindo's words, a sterile brilliance, a set, polished rhetoric was the poor final outcome. Yet, before intellectualism completely took over, we do witness some remnants of the earlier age, and like in, say, Milton's early works, because they are informed by a strong note of intellectuality, yet the earlier influences That is, you can say, the touch of romance, passion, and beauty. These are also visible components of his early works, where we see that is Chaucer, Spenser, Shakespeare, even Ben Jonson, all make their presence felt in early Milton, which is poetry rich, graceful, and powerful. Okay, so a few lines from his early poems, where he's saying, and this is how his poems were composed with a certain kind of passion. For we were nursed upon the self same hill, fed the same flock by fountain shade and rill, together both ere the high lawns appeared under the opening eyelids of the morn. We drove afield and both together heard what time the grey fly winds her sultry horn, battening our flocks with the fresh dews of night, off till the star that rose at evening bright toward heaven's descent had sloped his westering wheel. So we see the excess of images here, and the whole poem seems more a work of conscious effort than exactly spontaneous expressions. Of course, the theme is a timeless one on death and mortality, and the poet's own reflection on these is visible. So, Milton's early verse is an infusion of the earlier masters like Virgil and Lucretius, and their majesty and grandeur are part of the beauty of Miltonic verse. He could catch something of that. Though the substance here is not heavy, the form, Sri Aurobindo says, is of a faultless beauty. But it is clear that his views on life and nature uh, are from the intellect mainly, and the change to the intellectual mode is visible even in some of his early poems. So let's take a few lines from his Comos, where he's saying, mortals that would follow me love virtue, she alone is free. She can teach ye how to climb higher than the sphery chime. Or if virtue feeble were, heaven itself would stoop to her. So this is the style of Comos. It has a moral theme and a melodious rhythm. Um, so after this, we have the Caroline poets like say Thomas Carew, Herrick, John Suckling. These are influenced by the past Elizabethan spirit, but not strongly enough to carry it all through. And they these Caroline poets, whom we name these they posed a sort of opposition to the rational and Puritan mind of the age, and there are very few poets of this group, and they indulged in lighter trivial kind of poetry. For instance, look at these lines of sensuous poetry, which reflect at least some characteristics of this group of poets. This is from Thomas Carew, where he's saying, ask me no more where those stars light that downwards fall in dead of night, for in your eyes they sit, and there fixed become as in their sphere. But sometimes the lingering note of Puritan seriousness is also found in their works, and at times even a high note in the lyrics. So look at these lines. These are very popular lines in English poetry. That is, stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. Minds innocent and quiet take that for an hermitage. If I have freedom in my love and in my soul am free, angels alone that soar above enjoy such liberty. So very readable and quotable lines because of the metric arrangements and the cadence, if not for the thought content of the lyric. So, in the next age, after the Elizabethan, the prominent note is that of intellectualism, and the life sense and emotional values all are put into use by the intelligence. So, sight and emotion take a backseat, and the reflective idea takes their place. So, this was the age of intellect, and it was a long one. According to Sri Aurobindo, it was a whole long, dry, metallic century. Now, that should spell the bane of actual uh, poetry. So, and what this century brought us, or rather, what it took away from poetry, was its lyrical faculty and the higher powers. Yet, it gave us definitely a great work, the great epic of Milton, Paradise Lost. But even this work suffers by its absence of the noble qualities of his own earlier works. The pagan delicacies, as Sri Aurobindo puts it, with their color, grace, and sweetness, do not characterize the epic as they had his early creations. Because Paradise Lost is an epic and it's on a different note. After all, there was a break in Milton's poetic activities between his early creations and the epic, and much of his creative energy was invested in political activities. The discontinuity perhaps accounts for the change in Milton's poetic motive and methods. And Sri Aurobindo wonders what would the poetic output have been had Milton continued without this break? Maybe he would have composed his epic in a ripened continuity and deepened strength of his earlier works. Yet it is on Paradise Lost that the fame of Milton rests, and he has attained a permanent high rank among poets for the epic. Though the age was one of dry intellectualism, yet it has gifted us the supreme poetic creation of Paradise Lost. Here is one attempt of English poetry to get a complete balance and perfection of architectonic form and structure. So let us dwell now on the merits and demerits of this great epic poem. Now, counting the greatness of Paradise Lost, Sri Aurobindo says that Milton has successfully endowed English speech with intellectual thought. It is poetical in itself and has an intrinsic force. It is poetry blended with inspired intellectual thought utterance. So let us listen to a few lines where Milton writes, "Let none admire that riches grow in hell. That soil may best deserve the precious bane. And here let those who boast in mortal things and wondering tell of Babel and the works of Memphian kings. Learn how the greatest monuments of fame and strength and art are easily outdone by spirits reprobate." So this idea actually faintly re-echoes in later poets like Pope, who were more intellectualized. But here it's an epic expression, all right, with both rhythm and speech attaining the epic amplitude and height. The epic sublimity is felt both in the matter and the manner, and Sri Aurobindo says it was Milton only who was capable of those magnificent sound tones and amplitude of gait in the rhythm of the lines. And all these he has been able to sustain all through till the end, at least of the first two books. But on any account, the opening books of the epic are on a much higher level than the rest in the conception and execution, especially of the character of Satan and the picture of hell. So I'll just read out, listen to this magnificent opening of the epic, where Milton writes, "Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat." So it announces in a grand way the seriousness of the mighty task that Milton has undertaken to achieve. And then, of course, the figure of Satan is so very powerfully drawn. And in fact, Satan is such a it's such a powerful figure that it has elicited comments like Milton belonged to the devil's party without knowing it. So it's so very powerfully drawn. And we'll see the reasons for this. Okay, so in book one, Milton writes about Satan. "Thus Satan, talking to his nearest mate, with head uplift above the wave, and eyes that sparkling blazed, his other parts besides, prone on the flood, extended long and large, lay floating many a rood, in bulk as huge as whom the fables name of monstrous size." So it's the diction and the cadence here that give meaning to the descriptive lines on Satan and it's overwhelming. Yet, more powerful is the message that is the symbol of the infernal serpent when Milton describes Satan's rebellious acts in these words. He it was whose guile, stirred up with envy and revenge, deceived the mother of mankind, and with ambitious aim against the throne and monarchy of God, raised impious war in heaven and battle proud with vain attempt. Sri Aurobindo says it is a power portraiture of the living spirit of egoistic revolt fallen to its natural element of darkness and pain. But Milton could not fulfill the great promise of his high aim and lofty subject as the total performance, that is, the poem as a whole, is not satisfactory. Though greatness of style and rhythm, these are there, but compared to the early part, the later books of the epic fall below the mark. It is thus that Paradise Lost misses its destiny of being perhaps the greatest poem in literature, and it has not secured a permanent place in the minds of men, except in the opening books. Of course, there was a disparity between Milton's high aim and the means afforded to expound it, which was intellectual. But that is not the real cause of its defeat. Sri Aurobindo points out that Puritan theology was in itself not a good enough aid for Milton's professed high purpose. He had taken up too ambitious a project, and the scriptural legend could have sufficed as poetry had it been interpreted in a profounder way. But Milton failed, not only because of the dominant intellectualism in him, uh, and Sri Aurobindo says Milton's failure was of a more radical kind. Because, first of all, as we have seen, he set out to justify the ways of God to man. That was his aim in Paradise Lost. But his was the vision of a poet, and this is precisely where he went wrong. The poetic vision cannot do what Milton intended to do in the intellectual way. The task of the poet is to reveal, whereas Milton, being the great poet he was, wanted to justify the ways of God intellectually. And why does his depiction of evil seem more powerful than that of God or man? Because Milton was dealing with scripture, a scriptural legend, and could imbibe its greatness and incorporate its spirit in his work. But he was not, or he did not encounter God and heaven in his vision. He has not the poetic insight to see the fallen man's striving for redemption or his yearning for bliss. So Milton's basic failure is, as Sri Aurobindo says, a failure of vision. His poetic interpretation of scriptural material is very weak. Perhaps that is the price he had to pay for being predominantly intellectual. His language and rhythm and architecture are great, but Sri Aurobindo says they are only an exterior clothing for a nobly carved out lifeless image. This is because Milton never sought to carve out a living figure of truth. Thought replaces sight in Paradise Lost, whereas the early works of Milton were suffused by his imaginative vision. And Sri Aurobindo says even when poetry is intellectual, it should have more of imaginative thought. Now, Milton's early works and the early part of Paradise Lost did not suffer much on this account, but the defects of this preoccupation with externalized thought are to be found in almost all his later works, say the latter part of Paradise Lost itself, Samson Agonistes, and also Paradise Regained. And anyone who just makes a comparison between Paradise Regained and Paradise Lost will find how much the latter epic suffers. And Sri Aurobindo says about Milton's later compositions that in them the supreme vitalizing fire has sunk. So let us read some lines from Milton when a deeper spirit worked in him and after that deeper spirit had departed. Some of the speeches given to Satan are in highly inspired tones of poetry. We can take up any from the first two books of Paradise Lost. For instance, these are some lines spoken by Satan, where he's saying, after he has been hurled down to hell and he has to come to terms with this changed, altered environment, and he says, is this the region, this the soil, the clime, this the seat that we must exchange for heaven? But here you see, Satan does not long mourn for this loss. He says, be it so. And his fiery spirit then utters these words, heroic in their grandeur. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell a hell of heaven. What matter where if I be still the same? Here we may reign secure, and in my choice, to reign is worth ambition though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Now, except that these are words uttered by Satan, they are high pitched in tone, grand in movement, and truly befitting an epic like Milton's Paradise Lost. Unfortunately, the poet could not sustain in himself these great and sublime qualities for long, and so his later works reflect the result of inadequate inspiration. So let's take a few lines from his later work. That is, these are from his dramatic poem Samson Agonistes, where Samson, imprisoned and gone blind, cries out, complaining about his blindness. He says, oh, worse than chains, dungeon, or beggary, or decrepit age. Light, the prime work of God, to me is extinct, and all her various objects of delight annulled, which might in part my grief have eased. I, dark in light, exposed to daily fraud, contempt, abuse, and wrong, within doors or without, still as a fool in power of others, never in my own scarce half I seem to live, dead more than half. Now, see, these, when we compare it with, say, Satan's speech in Paradise Lost, comparatively, these seem more like a statement Samson is making to his audience rather than an emotional lament, that is, an emotional outburst. So, gone is the high dramatic pitch and intensity of the early Milton. Okay, so the next age in English poetry was an age of unredeemed intellectuality, with complete absence of genuine poetic inspiration, except very rarely. So, exceptions are always there. And the defects of the age of Milton come in more glaring forms here. This was the age of Pope and Dryden, and the sole aim of this school of poets was thinking in verse, to use Sri Aurobindo's own words. Now, let's look at a curious fact about this age also. The poets of this rationalizing age had chosen as their models the Augustan poets of Rome. So you can imagine the chosen models, the source of their creations. But the Latin strength and weight could not be copied successfully, as usual, and were replaced by superficiality and triviality in the hands of the English poets. So these imitators discarded also their own virtues gathered from the past ages, like the Elizabethan language with its exhilarating expressions, the rich imagination and vision, even with their crudeness and the sweetness and grace. And these poets also replaced Milton's Latinisms with rhetorical pomp. So look at the substitutes. And the English poets also copied the contemporary French poets, but here again, they could not imbibe the taste or imitate the greatness of classical French models. The substance of English pseudo-Augustan poets were it was of lesser worth to and at par with their methods. Their aim was to express their thoughts, and in their expressions, we hardly look for nobility of will or any kind of fine appeal or charm. What is there is only facile reasoning. Take as example these lines from Pope's very popular work, Essay on Man, where he's saying, Vice is a monster of so frightful a mien, as to be hated needs but to be seen. Yet seen too oft, familiar with her face, we first endure, then pity, then embrace. So this is polished verse with its own intellectual thought content and fine reasoning. Now, what happens in this age is we see even great ideas are subjected to intellectual reasoning and thus become shallow and external. Only when these poets handle the satiric form do they come into their own with robust vigor and truth of expression. Take these lines from Dryden's hard hitting satire. He's saying, Great wits are sure to madness near allied, and thin partitions do their bounds divide. Else, why should he, with wealth and honor blessed, refuse his age the needful hours of rest? Punish a body which he could not please, bankrupt of life, yet prodigal of ease. So, this is a direct satire from his poem Absalom and Achitophel. So, Pope and Dryden are good poets. They are satirists, and the general merits of English poetry are to be found in them, like, say, abundant energy and driving force. Also, we must say here that they practice to perfection the art of expressing themselves in couplets. But then, when one uses the same form forever, it leads to a certain monotony. And we can hardly call their poems uh, anything more than a long string of couplets and passages. Okay, so the English Augustan age is far below in poetic culture from the Roman which inspired it. And there is more often than not lack of genuine thought power. For instance, look at a few couplets which make up Pope's translation of Homer, sans the epic grandeur and vigor, of course. And he writes, The troops exulting sat in order round, and beaming fires illumined all the ground. Or from his Dunciad, take these couplets. See mystery to mathematics fly. In vain they gaze, turn giddy, rave, and die. Religion, blushing, veils her sacred fires, and unawares morality expires. So, there is a visible departure from the higher kind of poetry, leading to a failure. And Sri Aurobindo says, if not a resonant failure, at least a descent to lower levels. And though inferior in certain ways than the Romantic or Victorian ages, this intellectual age of English poetry gave us some of the most brilliant and energetic verses, especially in the form of the satire, mock heroic, and didactic. So consider some permanently great achievements of Dryden and Pope, like Alexander's Feast or Rape of the Lock. These have their own poetic value, with occasional great outbursts of emotion and power, and move and delight us. For instance, in lines like these, which are the result of imaginative vision and spell out the sheer luxury of the imaginary. These are from Alexander Pope's mock epic, The Rape of the Lock, where he is describing his aerial creatures, spirits of his imagination. And how beautiful is the description! See, some to the sun their insect wings unfold, waft on the breeze or sink in clouds of gold. Transparent forms, too fine for mortal sight, their fluid bodies half dissolved in light. Loose to the wind their airy garments flew, thin glittering textures of the filmy dew, dipped in the richest tinctures of the skies, where light depots in ever mingling dyes. So, this is a very beautiful description. So, the contribution of poets like Pope and Dryden to the psychological development of poetry is mainly intellectual, concerned more with superficial aspects of thought and life. But that is to be naturally expected from the poets of an age which was almost devoid of emotion and sentiment in the poetic field, where lyricism had run dry and life itself had become too urbanized to have any living contact with nature. It was everywhere the glitter and power of the rhetoric, the pomp and artifice, and beauty portrayed was also artificial. Yet, within limits, the poetry of the age achieved much, just being short of achieving the highest poetic greatness. Augustan poetry, without that Roman nobility and even without that English sincerity, stands firmly, however, on its lower summits, not reaching the peaks of Parnassus. But Sri Aurobindo says this phase was also necessary because every turn and movement has its own uses. Now, English poetry had to sacrifice much to learn a firm and straightforward expression of thought and precise and lucid speech. But this sacrifice of much of its native powers was immense and entailed as much effort in recovering these later on. And we can say with Milton, till one greater age came to restore all this. And what followed the age of dry reasoning and intellectualism was a striking and revolutionary outburst of poetry. So, we shall deal with the great English romantics in our next talks. And we can say the old order changeth, yielding place to new. So, we'll see what the great romantics will bring for us. So, thank you for today.